CSIS and the Project on Military and Diplomatic History. I'm Mark Moyer, the director of the project. For those of you who have not been to one of our events before, we were formed last year to promote the use of history in understanding foreign policy and also in informing the public. We seek to counteract what we think has been a negative trend in terms of declining influence of history on foreign policy, which has a lot to do with developments in the academic world, where military history has disappeared from most of our campuses, and diplomatic historians are increasingly moving away from traditional foreign policy issues towards obscure or politicized subjects that are of interest only to other professors and perhaps their spouses, which is why fewer students are studying diplomatic history these days, and also why the policy world is not paying attention to it as much. And we seek to promote the use of history in foreign policy in several ways. First, we like to provide platforms for historians who do in fact use history to help us understand the present, including today's speaker. Secondly, we like to promote interaction between historians and members of the policy community, such as our discussant today and also you, our audience. And third, we also seek to develop a community of historically minded people in the policy world. And hopefully you can stick around afterwards and exchange business cards and hopefully meet new people who share your interest in this subject matter. We've had close to 50 events this year. This is the second to last of the 2017 calendar year. The last one will be on the CORDS program in the Vietnam War on December 13th. We will kick off 2018 with an afternoon event on January 8th, which commemorates the 100th anniversary of Woodrow Wilson's 14th-point speech and its implications. If you sign up on our website, you can get all the latest info, and we will send you email invitations to all of our events. So today's subject is Sino-American competition, with a focus on nations that are known variously as the Third World, the Developing World, the Global South. Anyone who follows the news today is aware that there is competition between China and the United States. And you don't need to look far in this town to find all sorts of policy papers about the competition and what to do about it. You find much less about the historical precedents. And today's speaker contends, and we, I think, agree, that understanding the current competition can be achieved much more easily if we understand the past, and we will develop better policies if we have the historical context. We won't necessarily know what the correct answers are, but may stimulate new ideas, may also cause us to examine common assumptions that may actually be incorrect. So our speaker today is Dr. Gregg Brazinsky, who makes the case for the relevance of the history of Sino-American relations in his new book, which is called Winning the Third World, Sino-American Rivalry During the Cold War. It's his second book. I'd strongly encourage you to read it. I first came across Dr. Brazinsky's work several years ago when I was researching U.S. foreign assistance, and came across his first book, which is Nation Building in South Korea, Koreans, Americans, The Making of Democracy, which I found to be extremely informative and thought-provoking analysis of American assistance to South Korea in the Cold War, and really the best account I have seen of the role of the United States in the cultural and political transformation of another country. At some point, hopefully, we can do something on that subject as well. But the new book is equally groundbreaking and insightful. Again, I hope you have an opportunity to read it. He'll talk a bit about it today and whet your appetite a bit. Dr. Brazinsky is the Associate Professor of History and International Affairs at George Washington University. His research and teaching focus on the United States in East Asia. He's right now working on two additional projects, one focusing on cultural and economic relations between China and North Korea from 1950 to the present, and the other on American nation building in Asia. And he's also the director of the George Washington University Cold War Group. Also, before we bring Gregg up, I'll take a moment to introduce our discussant, Andrew Shearer, who's here. He joined us in May of 2016 as a senior advisor on Asia-Pacific security. He directs an exciting new CSIS project on alliances and American leadership. And before coming to CSIS, he spent more than 25 years in intelligence, national security, diplomacy, and alliance management, serving as National Security Advisor to Prime Ministers John Howard and Tony Abbott of Australia. He was also the political minister counselor at the Australian Embassy here across the street. As you might imagine, somebody with this much high-level experience in Australia is quite well-versed in China and the Sino-American competition. And Andrew also happens to have a keen interest in history and an appreciation of the use of history and its relevance to the present. So we thank him for taking time to be with us today and look forward to hearing his comments after we hear from the authors. So please join me in welcoming our speaker, Dr. Gregg Brazinsky.
Okay, thank you very much for that generous introduction, Mark. It's really a great privilege to be speaking here at this very, very relevant and important project. And I'm also very grateful that Andrew has agreed to be the discussant. So if you look at the book, it's about a 350 or 400-page book. And I'm going to try to talk about it in about 20 minutes. So what I thought I would do in this time is to try to highlight the parts, because this is a project that tries to look at the relevance of history to contemporary policy. I thought I would try to highlight the parts of the book that I thought were most relevant to contemporary issues. And I think a good way to start that is to talk about Xi Jinping's first trip abroad. In which, as General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, in which he went not to the United States, not to Pakistan, not to India, not to North Korea. He went to Russia briefly, but spent most of his first trip abroad in Africa. And speaking in Tanzania, he said the following. He said, in the 1950s and 1960s, the first-generation leaders of New China, Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, and others, and African statesmen of the older generation, ushered in a new epoch in China-African relations. Since then, the Chinese and African people have sincerely supported and closely cooperated with each other in the endeavor to fight against colonialism and imperialism and achieve national independence and liberation, and in the pursuit of development and national revival. A fraternal bond has been formed in this process, which has seen us through thick and thin. In this speech, what Xi Jinping was doing, I would say, is very explicitly linking China's Cold War era foreign policy towards Africa with its contemporary policy. He emphasized that China and Africa, these two countries, were linked by their shared history of colonialism and their common struggle to achieve higher living standards. Today, although the nature of China's involvement in Africa is very different from the Cold War era in a number of ways, you still hear China invoking a kind of rhetoric that's very similar to what it invoked in its policy towards Africa during the Cold War. For instance, today, you hear Chinese leaders talking about win-win cooperation, or mutually beneficial cooperation between China and Africa. These terms have their origins not in the late 1990s, but in the Cold War when China first started talking about these concepts. I think that the reason for this is because China's contemporary identity and its worldview were shaped very directly by its experiences in the 20th century and during the Cold War. But interestingly today, when people in the academic community and in the policy community talk about the relevance of China's history to its policy, the Cold War almost always gets completely ignored, or almost completely ignored. you hear a lot of people talking about the Ming Dynasty and the Qing Dynasty. A lot of people saying, well, China today is trying to reconstruct the old Sino-centric tributary system, which is weird because a lot of historians think the Sino-centric tributary system never existed. It's a very dated scholarship. For instance, Graham Allison's book, Destined for War, which has stirred a lot of discussion here in Washington, he talks repeatedly about the influence of dynastic Chinese foreign policy on contemporary policy. He approvingly cites Lee Kuan Yew, the past president of Singapore, who has argued that Beijing is trying to restore a world in which China was dominant and other states related to them as supplicants to a superior, as vassals came to Beijing bearing tribute. Now, my point is not that the more distant past is irrelevant. I'm a historian. I would never say history is irrelevant. But I do think that many in policy circles have this tendency to oversimplify and exaggerate the influence of more distant periods in Chinese history on the present when they ignore the more powerful and salient influences of the Cold War. And so I want to talk about a couple of interrelated arguments that I make in my book that I think have strong contemporary parallels. The first of these is the centrality, and as I think Mark was alluding to, we don't quite know what to call it, the third world, the Afro-Asian world, the global South, to Chinese policy then and now. I argue in the book that China's legacy of colonialism and the success of the Chinese Revolution in ridding the country of Western domination really led the People's Republic of China to see itself as a natural leader for Afro-Asian countries. And you can sort of see that here, China being sort of in the center of these rising revolutionaries from different Afro-Asian countries. During the Cold War, Chinese leaders repeatedly tried to make the case that they had something to offer people of newly independent countries in the global South that was different from and better than what the United States or the Soviet Union could offer, because they had also suffered at the hands of colonialism, and they were also a non-white people. They argued that they could introduce new forms of economic aid, new models of nation building that were better suited to the realities that people in the parts of the world that were gaining their independence from colonialism needed than those that were being introduced by the United States. They argued that these countries needed greater self-sufficiency and that they needed to be more independent from their metropoles. Zhou Enlai used to like to tell a story about how the United States had tried to set up a textile factory in Burma, but this factory, Zhou always said, had forced the Burmese to buy their cotton from the United States. So ultimately, it ended up making the country more dependent on the United States, and it had been a failure. China, though, later came and built a textile factory in Burma that was, in Zhou's words, based on indigenous circumstances and had therefore been more successful. This kind of rhetoric had appeal to many in the Afro-Asian world at the time. I think today, China does not use the rhetoric of anti-imperialism quite as brazenly as it did during the Cold War years. But at the same time, Afro-Asian countries still occupy a central place in Chinese thinking about the world, and China continues to believe, I think, that it has something to offer Africa and Asian countries that is different from what the West can offer. And you do sometimes hear Chinese scholars and Chinese policymakers talking about how Western models of economic development have failed and Chinese economic initiatives are different. Most recently, China put forward its One Belt, One Road initiative. Now, if you look at this, what they're actually doing, I think its resemblance to the Ming Dynasty, the Qing Dynasty, or even the old Silk Road is actually not that great. China's not seeking hierarchy or dominance through One Belt, One Road. Much of it is premised on the idea that China has experiences that can benefit countries in the region, and I think this is different from what others have talked about. Another argument that I make in the book is that status was central to China's Cold War foreign policy, and that at least during the Cold War, it was as or more important than economic and geostrategic considerations. Today, I think, what's more important, economy versus status versus geostrategy, maybe that's shifted a little bit. But nevertheless, I think it's something that persisted. And I argue in the book that status was important to China during the Cold War for two reasons. And the first is this so-called legacy of national humiliation. You still see Chinese talking about this today. This is a picture of, in China, little children holding up a banner, Wu Wang Guo Chi, Zhen Xing Zhonghua. Never forget national humiliation, revitalize China. This idea that China had been unfairly carved up and humiliated by the West, it influenced and gave China a determination to emerge as an important global actor and play a leadership role in the Third World. Another reason that I argue status was important to China during the Cold War was this man. The centrality of Mao Zedong. A slight to China during the Cold War was looked at as a slight to Mao Zedong and vice versa. A lot of Chinese activities during the Cold War were geared at promoting what was known as Mao Zedong thought, which included Mao Zedong's writings on revolution, guerrilla warfare, Marxism, and so forth. Why is this relevant? I think, first of all, you still see China referencing its past national humiliation today. You also see, I believe, a lot of diplomatic activities, the kinds of diplomatic activities that were used to promote China's status in the Third World during the Cold War continuing. For instance, China is still obsessed in a lot of ways with its global image. A lot of times, people go to China and the first thing they notice is the pollution, the air. But of course, whenever there's a big event in China, like these forums on China-Africa cooperation or the Olympics, the air is magically cleaner for a few days. And a lot of people, well, what is the relevance of that? It's because China is image conscious, and image influences status. Moreover, I think China's current leader, Xi Jinping, has probably tried harder to emulate Mao than any leader since Mao Zedong himself. Xi, thankfully, doesn't quite have the same kind of cult of personality that Mao Zedong created, but recently the CCP has been advancing this idea of Xi Jinping thought, which means that Xi's ideas will permeate many new aspects of Chinese life, and in particular that they will be influential in China's approach to foreign affairs. So China continues to take the status of its leaders, both domestically and internationally, very seriously. In addition to these two arguments about China and its status and the relevance of the Third World, there's also an argument that I make about the U.S. response and how the U.S. responded to China. I look at how, throughout the Cold War, the United States tended to see its competition with China as being very much a zero-sum game. A gain for China anywhere in the world, in terms of prestige, in terms of security, was looked at almost automatically as a loss for the United States. And one thing, I look at a variety of different things in the book. One thing I look at in particular is China's participation in international conferences and how the United States responded. One of the most interesting examples of this is in 1954 during the Geneva Conference, which was this conference that was held to try to settle the fate of Korea and Vietnam. After the Korean War ended in an armistice, there was still no permanent peace treaty. And so it wasn't really certain what permanent peace should look like. And of course, in 1954, Indochina and Vietnam are a mess. So the great power, the United States, Russia, Britain, France, hold a conference to try to settle these issues, and China is invited. And at the conference, Zhou Enlai tries to make a nice gesture to the United States. He apparently approaches U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and tries to shake his hand. But Dulles basically walks briskly by him and tries to ignore him completely. And so this is the dynamic, though. China trying to raise its prestige and visibility at these conferences, the United States trying to shut China out as much as possible. This was also the case at another conference, the famous 1955 Afro-Asian Conference at Bandung. Here again, China really sought to use this conference as an opportunity to show other Afro-Asian countries that it was committed to peace and that it was going to be a central actor in shaping the fate of the Afro-Asian world during the 1950s. The United States and the Eisenhower administration do everything that they can to try to undermine this conference. They hold meetings with their conservative allies in the Afro-Asian world. First, they encourage them to try to boycott the conference. Later, they say, well, you can attend the conference, but make sure when you're there, you refute China's arguments to the greatest extent possible. And by this kind of diplomatic tactic, the United States tried to isolate China throughout the 1950s and prevent it from making gains in prestige. And I thought of this recently in conjunction with this article that I just came across on Twitter the other day that was published by Evan Feigenbaum in Foreign Affairs. And I was just struck by the similarities between how the United States responded to China in Bandung and other major conferences. And he talks about the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, which had been established through Chinese initiative. And there's these sort of efforts by Washington to discourage other Asian countries from participating in the bank and trying to diminish the bank's importance. Much as the United States had done during the Cold War, there's this effort to try to isolate China or limit its influence. But as during the Cold War, these efforts were not very successful, I argue. In the book, what I say is that China actually never gains the prestige that it sought in the Afro-Asian world. But I also argue that this wasn't necessarily because of the wisdom or insight of American foreign policymakers. I argue that instead, when the United States and China have thought in absolutist terms about the international order, it has almost always led them to unproductive clashes. Ironically, American efforts to try to block China from participating in different conferences and organizations often led the United States itself to look more domineering. So if I could sum up, I believe that at some level, Sino-American competition is inevitable. We have different interests. We compete economically. But we compete with a lot of countries. We compete with our allies. We compete with South Korea. Think Apple versus Samsung, right? We compete with a lot of different countries in a lot of different ways. But I think there is a way that we can have a healthy competition with them that also includes some measure of cooperation. I think only through greater cooperation will it be possible for China and the United States to work together to solve issues such as non-proliferation, climate change, the issues that plague the world in the 20th century. One of my favorite writers, George Bernard Shaw, used to say, if I have an apple and you have an apple and we exchange apples, then we both still only have one apple. But if I have an idea and you have an idea and we exchange ideas, then we both have two ideas. And I think that's sort of relevant to how the US and China might approach the Afro-Asian world in the 21st century. They have different national experiences, different ideas that can be relevant, but the world will benefit more if these ideas are combined and put together in a more cooperative way. So I will end there, and thank you very much again.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Greg, for that very stimulating talk. And we will now hear from Andrew Shearer, and then have some discussion.
Thanks, Mark. And Greg, first, thanks and congratulations on a really tremendous book. We were talking earlier, and you were careful to give your sort of professional historian's product disclaimer about overstretching history, and that's fair enough. But I'm a policy guy, so I'm always looking around for bits of history I can scavenge to shed insight into policy. And as I was thinking about your book and your talk just now, I was struck by two sort of Australian data points and some of the resonances that I think your book highlights. And one of the really useful things that I think the book does is to remind us that often when we think back about the Cold War, we think of it as a sort of binary US-Soviet competition, playing out globally. The book reminds us that that's not right, that the US-China competition was a very salient part of the Cold War. And the two sort of data points I had in mind from an Australian viewpoint were, of course, that when the Korean War broke out, Australia was one of the group of countries that was quick to deploy forces. And in many ways, our alliance with the United States has its origins in that war. And what was driving Australian strategy at the time, apart from our general inclination to get into any sort of rumble that America gets into, the real driver was concern about Chinese communist expansionism, particularly into Southeast Asia, and that was still a driver leading up to the war in Vietnam, where the Australian government was actually advocating more and earlier US military intervention, not less. So I was very kind of struck by that resonance from an Australian point of view when I looked at the Australian foreign policy white paper that was put out just a couple of weeks ago now and is totally framed around Sino-US competition and the implications for the region. So I think that struck me very much. I think your focus on status is interesting as well, and the role of that in competition. Again, I'll be careful not to sort of oversimplify, but I think sometimes we're so focused on the economic dimension of the current competition and increasingly the military one, which is playing out in the Western Pacific in particular, but increasingly further away, the Indian Ocean and so forth. But the status question, I think, still underlies a lot of this. And you talked about the bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I was very much involved in the debate inside the Australian government about whether or not to join the bank and the toing and froing with the White House at the time. And, I think you're right to highlight that. And, when you look at things like China's anxiousness to get the United States to sign on to a construct like the new model of great power relations, or these other constructs, these often sort of forms of words which as Westerners we tend to be sort of a little bit dismissive of, they're just slogans or they don't matter that much. They're very important to the Chinese, and they're important because of status, and I think your book usefully underlines that The Chinese Communist Party, in my view, because of still deep-seated ambivalence about its own legitimacy, is very focused on status, and we need to factor that, I think, into our policies. The other resonance I noticed was that with the Korean War as a sort of obvious example, the competition between the United States and China in the Cold War was very often not in the military realm, and your book, I think, highlights this very well. It was in some respects economic. It was about sort of cultural exchanges. It was about some sort of symbolic use of aid in the developing world. And again, I think that's really interesting when you go and look at something like the Belt and Road Initiative, which you mentioned in your talk. Again, I think there's a real kind of echo there in that approach, while of course there is still a military component to the competition, where you've got a situation where China is, I think, in many senses posing a pretty full frontal challenge to US military power in the Western Pacific in particular. I think it's really interesting too, to look at this question of US policy and the sort of inclination to resist China's power and some of the echoes. But the other point that I think comes out in the book is the limits of the alternative, which is engagement. And your sort of optimistic, grace note at the end of your talk was, it's hard to argue. We should all cooperate more. Would be nice. But I think, one thing the book does is reminds us that US policy, when it tried to block China, was often less effective actually than China's own overreach in reducing Chinese influence in the developing world. And I think there are echoes of that today too, where countries feel, bullied or bribed or, whatever, as a result of some of Beijing's more overbearing diplomacy, and that if you look around the region, one of the things you see is quite a strong sort of balancing impetus, and I think that's more about, frankly, Chinese overstretch than it is about, sophisticated American policy responses like the rebalance arguably was intended to be. So I think that's interesting. But I was also very struck just by one of the documents that you cited in the book, which was a 1966 report coming out of a State Department Defence Study Group, which talked about fundamental conflict in the Chinese Communist Party's objectives of regional hegemony and our own, America's own, fundamental interests in preventing the domination of Asia by any single power. That's a sort of, classic statement of American grand strategic intent, I guess. But that report in 1966, I guess, echoing your grace note at the end of your talk, talked about drawing China into the international community as a way to give it the status it desired, which it could substitute for the unattainable goals of regional domination and superpower status. And that's very interesting, of course, because that hopeful approach, I would argue, underpinned American policy, really from 1972 up to perhaps today, depending on, the latest tweet on American trade policy. And I think there's a growing view, maybe not in the academic community, but certainly in the policy community in Washington, that's a policy which unfortunately has kind of run its race. And I think you can see that in business opinion, in the US business community, where I think some of the earlier optimism about the potential of China as a sort of, reasonably equal and collaborative economic partner is pretty much done. That's washing out into the debate in politics, obviously, and where trade policy is going. So just to balance your sort of positive note, I just want to add my own little negative note at the end there and say, well, I think it's right to acknowledge the limitations to that policy of constraining or even containing China's rise Perhaps we need also to be equally careful of exaggerating the potential for engagement and cooperation to really significantly affect the course of that competition. I'll throw it over to you with that.
So would you like to respond?
I guess I would respond, briefly to a few points. I think first you'd said the book sort of breaks us out of this binary view of the Cold War, and I think that was part of my intention. One of the criticisms that I've gotten, especially from people who are Soviet experts, is like, well, you didn't give the Soviets enough of a role. And I do talk about the Soviets and how Sino-Soviet competition played into Sino-American competition in the book. But I do think, there's a lot of different lenses you could use to looking at the Cold War. I think traditionally the scholarship has always taken U.S. Soviet, and as a result, the importance of China has been left out, and also the importance of other actors. For instance, Pero Glejeses, who teaches down the road at CSIS, has often made a case for the importance of Cuba as an actor. So I think this binary view is something which has been slowly getting pulled apart by diplomatic historians. I think you'd also talked about sort of, my emphasis on status and sort of status's relevance to today and status versus military and economic models. I think this is an interesting question. I would say one thing that I say in the book, and that is that status, it doesn't have to be, pursuing status doesn't have to be entirely discrete from pursuing military and economic objectives. In fact, achieving status can also be helpful in achieving these more tangible objectives. So I think they're not, it's hard to completely pull them apart. In the book, though, I sort of emphasized what were the U.S. and China really competing over. And that's where I believe during the Cold War, it was status. The final point that you made about the hopeful approach versus the more negative approach, I think that's also interesting. I can't say completely which is right and which is the best direction to going forward, but I would say one thing, which is that the idea that China is potentially a great power and that its wealth and its growth will benefit the United States has been something that has been one of the core beliefs of American and Asian policy going back all the way to the 19th century. If you look at the open door policy, it was backed by this same sort of hopefulness that China was going to grow and become more powerful, and it would be a useful market. And then during World War II, FDR had this idea that after the war, China was going to be one of the main global policemen, and it was going to play a critical role in enforcing global security. And of course, there was another cycle of disillusionment after that. And then, of course, you have this period, which I think you were talking about, from, say, the 1970s to the present, when there was all of this hope that China would be an important market and eventual ally, but now, you're right, there's a little bit of disillusionment with it. But I think it's important to remember that there's always been sort of a cycle of optimism and disillusionment in how Americans see China. And so even if we're now going into a period of disillusionment, I think that there will eventually be another period of optimism. I don't know when exactly that will happen, but if you look at past historical patterns, this has always been the case. So thank you.
Greg, do you think that if you accept the premise of the white paper that I mentioned, the Australian government one, that the two countries are coming closer to parity, does that make competition more likely or less likely?
I think it's hard to say completely. Part of it depends a lot on what the United States does and how the United States reacts to China achieving greater parity. I think when you talk about when people talk about well, great powers inevitably clash. I think that, or the hegemon always clashes with the rising power. I think that doesn't really help the situation. But I do think I don't think it necessarily lends itself to either one or the other. I think having greater parity is also something that could potentially make China more confident and less defensive, and a little bit less likely to project this kind of self-defensive nationalism. And I also think that the two countries are so deeply interwoven now, economically, and there's so many other global issues now, such as climate change, where our fates are so deeply intertwined that I think the parity need not be something that will automatically produce more conflict. It can also be something which gives at least the Chinese side the right perspective. And so it could also be something that might enhance opportunities for cooperation, as I see it.
I want to let Mark open it up, but there's just one other question that the book sort of raised for me. That's really the ideational sort of component of all of this. One of the things that struck me, and I'm not a China expert, but coming out of the recent Party Congress, was the focus on in President Xi's speech on the Chinese model having sort of applicability outside China, particularly in the developing world, and that was interesting to me because I think in pursuing this policy broadly, speaking of engagement with China over this period, the 70s, 80s, 90s, and up to now. One of the things that you often hear sort of Western policy officials say is that, of course, competition and conflict with China is not inevitable because, after all, they're not interested in exporting their model. Mm-hmm. So I guess my question is, and I noticed there's a Reuters report with President Xi quoted today saying, we're not interested in exporting our model, which maybe is a reaction to his speech at the Congress. But, what's your take on that, and how does that fit into the book?
Right. I do think today Chinese policymakers tend to be very cautious when they talk about exporting their model. I sometimes think it's sort of an underlying assumption that they have more than something that they go around saying. And so it informs their worldview, and occasionally, like in the Party Congress address, it comes out. But they're often very shy about asserting it too strongly. But I think another thing I would mention while we're on this is it was also the case, I think, during the Cold War that the Chinese would often say, the Maoist model would be excellent, but you also have to tailor it to your indigenous circumstances a little bit. So there's some element of that as well. But I do think I do think it's an underlying assumption. I do think Chinese have some idea that because they're an Asian country, because they have a shared legacy of colonialism, because they achieved late economic development relatively swiftly, that for all of these reasons, they have something that people in poor Asian and African countries today crave. And they can do it, give it to them in a way that the West cannot. And I do think that you're right. I mean, you do see them sometimes being hesitant to talk about this too publicly, in part because maybe they know how the United States will react to it. But I still think that that is an underlying assumption, although I think if some CCP, people in the CCP heard me speaking right now, they may say, well, no, it's not. So,
Greg, and I want to ask one follow-up question on that, because I was thinking on the similar lines to Andrew. Looking back in the Cold War, when you were trying to sell the model at the time being the Marxist-Leninist model, could you just talk a little bit about how successful or unsuccessful China was during the Cold War in selling that model, and what perhaps how that might help us understand competition today between us and their model?
Right. Well, I think the success was very mixed during the Cold War. I think sometimes the Chinese weren't as successful as they thought they were. For instance, one of the cases that I talk about in the book is Chinese assistance to Vietnamese insurgents during the Vietnam War. And the Chinese were really sort of assuming that, well, Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese were really seeking to emulate the Chinese model of revolution. But actually, they weren't quite trying to do that. They wanted to learn from the Maoist model in some ways, but they were also very nationalistic and had their own objectives. And so that's one thing that I think has implications for today's world is that nobody wants to just import anybody's model wholesale. I think most countries and parts of the world that are eager for national development want to get the best ideas and attract funding from any source that they can. So, the idea that you can just take one model and transplant it was something that was, I think, a flaw in Chinese thinking and also a flaw in American thinking just as much. And I also talk about the Chinese approach to economic development, and I actually say that they were relatively successful in some ways. Now, they weren't successful in that Chinese aid facilitated rapid economic development in Southeast Asia or Africa, but they were politically successful in that these kinds of aid projects that encouraged self-sufficiency rather than dependence were something that had some intrinsic appeal. And again, today China's economic aid is very, very different from what it was during the Cold War. During the Cold War, a lot of what they were doing would be, set up a tea factory or set up a matchstick factory, something that can make a country more independent and self-sufficient in one commodity. Today, it's obviously very different, but still, this craving for economic independence and the appeal that it had is something that I think we should keep in mind and not forget.
Great. Well, thanks. And we now have time for some audience questions. Gentleman here in the second from the back. If you could wait for the microphone, please. And please state your name and
Ray Town from Georgetown University, a graduate. Thank you for your very insightful and I think your insight on history, I think, got very interesting ideas. Some points to comment on your very short kind of briefing. For China, with a long history, it tends to be very, it's easy to have a oversimplification of reading of history. First, whether China will go back to the tributary system, the long history Ming Dynasty, I think it's not. You're right, the point that China, the 100 years humiliation, I think it's a driver domestically for China to be developing as a strong country. It doesn't mean that China will, get a revenge herself over the countries, neighboring countries, over all the international system. No. The Cold War history, I mean, I don't think there was a rivalry between China and the United States. Basically, it's a reaction. I mean, from China's perspective, it's a reaction. It's a survival, or it's a final way to break through of the blockade from Western kind of bloc. For example, the Sino-African relationship, I think is a tradition rather than an exception when you talk about Xi Jinping's visit to African country. I think every year when you observe that the first country or continent the Chinese foreign minister will visit is African countries. I think this is a legacy rather than an asset rather than liability. So China helped herself by helping African countries, and it's a sincere help by giving them deliverables.
So just to get
okay, very short.
Question.
Very short. And the question is perception. China now is not the China 20 years before. So how international community, including the United States, to see China, perceive China is very important for China's reaction. Thank you very much.
Yes, I think this idea of perception and changing perceptions of China is actually very interesting and important. During the 90s, I think China was very successful on selling a lot of countries on this idea of the peaceful rise, and that China was going to become more developed and more powerful, but this wasn't necessarily going to have a negative impact on other countries in the region. But one of the things that I also talk about in the book is that sometimes China's own sort of lack of confidence and this tendency to project an overzealous nationalism is something that hurt it during the Cold War, and it's also something that has a negative impact now. I think there's been more mistrust of China because of South China Sea issues during the last 10 years than there was during the 90s. I think in Africa you also see a growing amount of disillusionment with some of what China is doing. I think in Africa the perception is very mixed. You still have some African leaders who see China as the wave of the future, but you also see some African leaders saying, well, actually, Chinese investment isn't really that different from what Western colonialism was. So, I think the point is that they haven't they haven't completely managed the public perception as well as they would like to, but it's something that's still very, very important to them, and I think it's something that will absolutely affect how successful and influential China is in these regions during the 21st century. So,
Question, ma'am, please.
Hi, Shirley Lin from University of Virginia. That was a very, very fascinating talk. I can't wait to look at the book and perhaps use it in my course. My question is, from the way you describe the model during the Cold War that extended to the continuation of China wanting to perhaps have other countries view it as a model and to achieve status and prestige. What you didn't mention, perhaps it's in the book, is of course the most important contrast today is China is an authoritarian and state capitalist system. And so this to many countries in emerging market is a shining example of something that has its sinister components. And what I find interesting about what you said for your study is during the Cold War, although it was something to distinguish China from other models in terms of being self-sufficient, today certainly that is not what China is trying to say about its model, because it is the most interdependent and large economy, and something a country like Vietnam, where I was just at, they have no illusion that they will be self-sufficient. So could you comment on how the model, the narrative that China is trying to use has transformed?
Right, I think that's a very good and complicated question. I don't know if I can answer all of it, but I would say, one point about China being authoritarian and, how good of a model did that make for other countries in the rest of the world. One thing that China would promote itself as during the Cold War was as a party state. And there were also actually other countries in Africa that, aspired to be single party states, and where they wanted the military to be loyal to the party as much as to the nation. So this was actually something that had some appeal. There weren't a lot of countries in the developing world at the time that wanted to be democratic, and you still see this today. I think in a more negative way, that you have. Countries, and you have some countries that don't want to democratize, saying, well, look, if you want to get rapid economic development, you need autocracy or authoritarian rule. And actually, my first book on South Korea, one of the arguments that I made is that if you look at the post-colonial world, it actually is the case that most of the states, at least in Asia, that achieved rapid economic development did so under what was called, I call developmental autocracies. Now I think China's developmental autocracy is quite different from South Korea's. and I think less likely to evolve towards greater democratization for a variety of different reasons. So I think that's sort of a very interesting and complicated question in how it's playing out. And I would say the same thing about the economic system. Absolutely, China has sort of differentiated itself from, say, Japan and some of the other East Asian tigers since the 1970s, in that it's had so much foreign direct investment and so much foreign involvement in its economic growth. And I think though, I think the content of what China is selling as the Chinese model is different. I wouldn't deny that. But what I would say is the same is that China continues to view itself as a country that overcame the legacies of poverty, colonialism, and invasion, and whether it did so through a more self-sufficient economic model or through a more open economic model, the Chinese all themselves used to say, well, you need to experiment with a lot of different things. So I think that's really the big similarity that I'm talking about, while acknowledging, of course, that the content can actually be very different. So.
Time for one last question. Sir.
Hi, Jake Barnett, Hudson Institute. Thank you for this very illuminating discussion. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about what you think the future of U.S. China relations over Africa is. I liked what you said about some disillusionment there among African leaders. I was in East Africa all last year, and I would add that another issue that a lot of locals have is the issue of integration with Chinese migrants in Africa. There seems to be some resentment there. And then specifically, if you could talk about maybe Zimbabwe, and whether you think U.S.-China policy will clash over the new administration, because some reports indicate that the coup plotters actually cleared the coup ahead of time with Beijing, indicating that the Chinese-Zimbabwe relationship is still quite strong.
Right, and I actually am not a Zimbabwe expert, so I'm a little hesitant to talk too much about it. But I did see those reports that the coup plotters had cleared this with Beijing ahead of time, and that is something that I mean it brings to mind almost the U.S. relationship with some of its Cold War its Cold War clients, where if you had a new government come into power, they always had to legitimize themselves first with the United States. So if that is if that is in fact the case, and again, I think the Chinese government has not been admitting this anywhere nearly as openly from what I've seen thus far. But if that is the case, then it speaks to sort of the depth of Chinese influence in some parts of Africa. I think going forward, there's probably going to be a mix. There's going to be a mix of competition in certain regards. I think for resources, absolutely that's an area where there's going to be competition. For political influence, there's going to be competition, and for which route do they follow politically and economically? Do they adopt political values more like those of the West and the United States, or do they have systems more like the ones that exist in China, where the premium is on a government that can maintain order? I think that is really sort of setting up to be the most important clash in future years, or competition, I should say. But there's also, I think it depends on the leadership in Washington. Under Obama, Obama really did say we're willing to partner with the Chinese in different parts of Africa. And there was some limited forms of cooperation at the end of the Obama administration I'm blanking on the name of this disease, the respiratory disease that was spreading in Africa. Ebola, I'm sorry. On Ebola and some of the other some of these kinds of issues, there's actually been limited cooperation. So I think going forward, it's most likely that there's going to be a mix. There's areas where our political visions of the future for Africa are very different. There's areas where we're going to compete economically, but I think there can be cooperation. And I think it's really, though, what will be the more important narrative? Will the narrative of cooperation be greater, or will the narrative of competition be greater? And I think that depends a lot on the leadership in both countries. I think one aspect is that the Chinese leadership tends to talk a lot less about we have to go in there and compete with the United States. They just sort of go about their business, whereas it's much more the U.S. that tends to be reactive, and that's a point that I make in my book, and I still think that's very much the case today. And a lot of times Americans have been overly hysterical and exaggerated some of the things that the Chinese are doing in Africa, and so that's why on the Zimbabwe case, I'm also a little bit reluctant to say yes, that was true, because there have been a lot of cases, where it's been reported in the Western media that Chinese aid projects were taking over this, but actually they were much more modest, and Chinese influence tended to be much more modest. So. I'm reluctant to believe it right away. Let's wait for information to get out and see. So I think it's a very good question. And again, I think the future, it can go in a lot of different directions. I think we need prudent leadership on both sides.
Well, thanks, Greg, and thanks, Andrew. As I mentioned earlier, hopefully you can stick around afterwards, swap business cards. Greg's here for a bit. I know Andrew has another engagement, but please join me in a round of applause for our speaker and discussant.
Thank you very much. Thank you for reading the book so carefully. I should have said that. I appreciated it. Yes. Thank you so much. Yes.
Great. Thanks, Andrew.